You went fast last week about Joseph.
Yeah, last week we blew through the end of the book of Genesis. Because now we have.
I thought you were. Wasn't she here last week?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I don't know. We need to review the tape. Yeah, because we have now Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to take care of in this 12 classes. So we went a little.
These are things that maybe in another year or so.
Yeah. We took our time through Genesis, which was great, I think. So this one today we're going to cover up till chapter 11. That's the plan. Yeah.
Start with chapter 1, right?
Yep. So let's pray for help. We're going to need it. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, Lord Jesus, thank you for this morning, and thank you for bringing us here healthy. Pray for Virginia, who's feeling a little under the weather. Pray for Regina, recovering. Pray for Glenna, the doctor, Lord. And just pray for anybody else who's going through some health difficulties, who just ask for healing touch from you. We know you can do it. We trust you can do it. We want to see it happen, Lord. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so let's open to Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1. Amen. And that's it for this week. So we'll see you. Exodus chapter 1. Exodus is such a fascinating book. I think it's so full of stories and conflict and the hand of God. But the Greek word for Exodus is departure. That's what it means, just departure. Right? So after a ball game or after the parade downtown, there was a mass exodus out of Boston, right? I heard there was 1.5 million people flooded the city for the parade. Jess and I thought about going, but then we thought about going and didn't, right? And didn't go. But a departure, right? The leaving of a place. And we know that it's the departure of the people, the nation of Israel, from Egypt, right? Last week we saw by the hand of God, by the wisdom of God, by the amazing plan of God, Israel was brought into the land of Egypt as 75 people. It says in Acts chapter 7, 75 people went in. And then now we see in the book of Exodus, it says 600,000 men, right? Plus, it says besides the children. So roughly 2 million people will be coming out, right? Yeah, from 75, right? So that's like, we could think that's our church growth plan. Right? We're over 75, so let's go towards 2 million. I don't know. That would be a lot. I don't know if I'm ready for that. 2 million people in church.
How many years was that? How many years from the 400?
400 years. Yeah, so Genesis chapter 15. Genesis 15, 12 through 15. God tells Abraham that they will go in to, they will be strangers in a land for 4 generations and 400 years they'll be there. And it ends up being 430 years by the time they're out. And when Joseph went in, right, Joseph goes in, he says, remember he told him, don't leave my bones here. Don't leave my bones here. So now we see things change, right? So in the beginning here, actually, let's do this. So there's 3 sections to this book, right? We can break Exodus down to 3 parts. The first part is chapters 1 through 14, and we see that people are slaves in Egypt. I noticed Egypt is an interesting word, because you have 3 of these in a row. I wrote it over and over again, and it kind of bugged me because there's these 3 letters in a row. Y or GYP. Anyway, it's my insight. The next section is chapter 15 through 18. This is when they're in the wilderness from Egypt to Sinai. From Egypt to Mount Sinai. Right? So this is one part of the journey. And then the last part of this book is 19 through 40. This is at Sinai, where they camp and receive the law. So these are the three parts. The major part is the end, right? The last part, where in such detail the law is given to Moses and everything. And then by the end of the chapter, the last chapter, the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle, right? After it's built by God's plan. So today we're going to go through most of the first part. Right? Most of the first part. That's God told Abraham that they would be a stranger in a land for 400 years. So let's look to Exodus chapter 1. The first 7 verses, right? First verse 1 through 7 is just a broad history. Just a real general history, quickly saying what is happening, right? It says the names of the children of Israel. It lists all of them. Right, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. Right. For Joseph was in Egypt already. So there's the 70 plus Joseph's family there. And that's what Stephen comes up with, 75 in Acts 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. All right, so there it is. That is like a big general idea. These people came in and then they grew abundantly. And that's it. And now there is a change. In verse 8, there's a change. A new king came in who did not know Joseph. Right? Now there arose a new king in Egypt who knew not Joseph. They think that this is actually there was another people invaded Egypt, actually, the Hyksos. Right? So the Hyksos people came in and they conquered Egypt. Right? Hyksos. They came in and they conquered Egypt, and actually they were similar, like kind of related to the Israelites. Where did I read that? Oh man, I don't have it written down. But anyway, they were less of a population, and they were insecure of their place with this huge population of Hebrew people in their place. They were insecure, so they enslaved them. Up until this point, they were free, right? Remember, the Pharaoh gave him the land of Goshen, and they had freedom. They were there, they were taken care of, they were basically royalty. But now a new king comes in, and things change. Right? Things change. He says in verse 10, "Let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falls out any war, they join our enemies and fight against us." So they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they grew and multiplied, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. So there it is. There's the change, right? From a place of favor into a place of slavery, and it's not good. Right? It's not good. We see also here in chapter 1 another time where there's a slaughter of the innocents. Right? We know that Herod did this in Christ's time, but also in Moses' time, Pharaoh attempted this. He came to the midwives and told them, if there is a child born to the Hebrews, kill them. Right? And 2 women, isn't this awesome? There's 2 women, 2 midwives are mentioned by name here, Shiphrah and Puah in verse 15. The Pharaoh isn't mentioned by name, right? Like the Bible doesn't mention his name. You can find it through history, but that's not significant here. But these two midwives are significant, and they're mentioned by name, and they defend life. And they wouldn't do it, right? Their obedience is to God. So there's a defense of life, and we see that there's also a blessing connected to it. It says in verse 20, "Therefore God dwelt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty." So this blessing that is given to the midwives is not given because of disobedience, right? We'd say, well, did God bless them because they disobeyed Pharaoh? But no, this blessing is associated to the obedience to God. Right? We see that throughout the Bible. We see it in the book of Acts, where Paul says, should I obey you or should I obey God? Right? And ultimately, we have a law that we are serving God, and we know what's right to Him. Right? So it's not a reward for disobedience to human government, but it's a blessing for obedience to God. And they disobeyed, right? And they are blessed, and the people grow more. So then Pharaoh says in verse 22, he says to all his people, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Another difficult time. Remember when we spoke about Joseph going into Egypt, and his family going into Egypt? It wasn't in a great time, right? It was during a famine. 7 awful years of famine, and that's when God had the time to build His nation. Right? That we would say, why don't we just do it in a good time? But He would do it in a difficult time. And the same here with Moses, that it is in a terrible time that Moses is born. It could have been at any point. Right? Why couldn't it have been in the years of favor that somebody was born and it just led them out peacefully? But actually we see that in a difficult time in slavery, that God raises up a man. Right, in chapter 2, we see the voice or the life of Moses is introduced. He was born in this time, and his mother hid him, it says, for 3 months. And it says she couldn't contain him anymore, right? She couldn't keep him quiet. She couldn't hide him anymore. So then she makes this basket and puts him in the river and floats him down the river. And his sister follows it. Isn't that a great visual, right? That she sees her little baby brother be put in the river, but she won't leave it alone. She follows it down the river and sees it. Ends up in Pharaoh's daughter's area there. And Pharaoh's daughter opens up the basket, sees the baby, and the sister says, hey, would you like me to find somebody to take care of that baby for you? Isn't that awesome? That God's people, God uses everybody. And she said, that's a great idea. That's a fantastic idea. So she goes and gets her mom, right? Brings her mom. And her mom not only gets to take care of her child, but she gets paid for it. Isn't that interesting? So then that's the life of Moses. In verse 10, the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him out of the water. Right? So that's Moses' life, and we can imagine it, right? Imagine that Moses' birth is to slaves, but then he's raised in Pharaoh's home, that he ends up being a prince, basically. And what a difference. But he was not actually satisfied with this life, we see, because he took time to come down and observe his people. He knew his people, right? He knew he was not Egyptian, and he goes down and he sees atrocity, right? He sees how Egypt is treating Israel, and he says, this is not right. Right? So he comes down out of his place as a prince, and he comes down amongst his people, and he has this awesome thing in his heart that he will deliver, that he will save, that he will act righteously for God. So he does it, right? And he kills an Egyptian, buries him in the sand, feels good about it. Comes back the next day, and he's with his people, and he says, let me help out. Let me help you guys out. Let me help you sort this out. And they look at him and they say, what, are you going to kill us too? Right? You're going to kill us too? And as soon as he hears that, immediately there's insecurity and he runs. He's just gone because he knows that they want to take his life. But imagine, like this picture of Moses, we'll see it repeated actually, that Moses is in a favorable place, right? This is the palace. It's a beautiful palace. All right, and then here are his people in slavery down here. That he actually does, he comes down to them. He leaves his place of comfort, he leaves his place of ease, of wealth, of value, and he comes down to them, and he wants to act. Like what is in his heart is actually right. And what he wants to do is actually honorable. And ultimately we see it's the same thing that God would have him do. Right? But it's his way. And he does it. And he's on a mission. He's going to do it. But it doesn't work out. Right? The whole plan is dashed. So he flees. Right? He's gone. He takes off and he spends 40 years back here with his father-in-law Jethro. Right? He goes, and actually his father-in-law is a high priest of his family, meaning he is the patriarch. He is basically of this little tribe of people. He's like the king, kinda. That he is the man, and he has his family. He gives Moses his wife, right? Or his daughter. I mean, his Moses' wife. Not you know what I mean. Yeah. So he dwelt there with them. But Moses still had something in his heart, right? Moses still knew that he had his people back in Egypt, and he feels like he had blown his opportunity for it. Maybe, I don't know. Verse 23, and it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up to God by reason of their bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Okay, so here's Moses and what he wants to do, right? And what he wants to do, but it's not time yet, right? It's not time yet, but we see here, this is significant, that basically he's saying in verse 23 through 25, time had come. Right? Time had come. This verse, right, this time had been fulfilled. This 400-something years that he spoke about to Abraham had been fulfilled. And now God is hearing the cry. He always heard it, right? These verses we say, well, God heard the groaning. He remembered his covenant. And then he had respect unto them. This isn't something different that God is doing, but it is the time has come, right? It doesn't say like he forgot about them in Egypt and left them there. All right? If we didn't know beforehand, if we didn't have this definition from God himself about the 400 years, then this verse would seem like, oh yeah, right? Oh yeah, my people. But instead, we do know that this is God's plan. And we do know that there will be 400 years. And now we see God ready to act and ready to engage in this time. So he meets Moses in the backside of the desert. Look at that. The backside of the desert. Chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. The backside of the desert. Does that sound like a fun place? No. The backside of the desert. Like this is oh, the west side of the wilderness? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So this is like, Moses is in the desert, but then it goes to the extent of it, right? The backside of the desert. It goes to the furthest part from it. Right? But this is where he receives a revelation. Right? He's in obscurity. Right? So here he is. He was in a place of honor and in a place that he felt like he could do something, and he came down and it failed. But now he finds himself in obscurity, right, in the backside of the desert, and this is where God speaks to him. God speaks clearly to him. That's a huge thing, that God speaks clearly to him. In the backside of the desert, right? Where was he, actually? The backside of the desert, we could say in failure. and failure, right? He had a mission. He wanted to come down. He wanted to deliver. He had failed. In shame, he ran. Right? He had been confronted with his wrong. Right? When he came to the two brothers who were fighting, and he said, "Now listen, I can help you." And they said, "What do you mean you can help us? You're a murderer," basically. And he was confronted with his shame, and he ran. Right? He ran. He didn't deal with it. Right? Now, and then also in condemnation. In condemnation. Right? That he knew what would happen to him if he went back and the Egyptians found him. He was a murderer, and he knew what the Egyptians would and could do to him. This is the backside of the desert, right? Pretty desolate place, isn't it? We have found ourselves there in times, right? With shame, with fear, with failure, and condemnation. But where does God reveal himself? Where does God come and put himself in a place that he can speak to us? In this, right? In this. That God is not afraid of this. In the life of Moses, God was not afraid of his failure, of his shame, and of his condemnation. But God came and spoke to him. And how did he match or overcome these things? But he did that by his revelation. Right? God speaks to him out of a bush. Isn't that amazing? He was walking through the desert one day, and all of a sudden there's a bush on fire, and it wasn't burning, it wasn't consumed. And I love how it says it in the King James. Moses in verse 3, and Moses said, "I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt." Right? I will now turn aside, right? So it catches his attention because the bush is, A, it's on fire, and B, it's speaking to him. Right? Hello? A bush speaking to you. So he goes aside and he looks at it. But look what he says first. Right? This is when God speaks, this is how he speaks to Moses. Moses, Moses, right? In verse 4, Moses, Moses. In verse 5, he says, take off your shoe, right? This is holy ground. So he establishes his holiness. Right? Take your shoe off your foot, because the place where you stand is holy ground. It is holy ground. When God speaks to us, this is what he says. I am different. Right? I am holy. I am different. This is something that does not have anything to do with the backside of the desert. It doesn't have anything to do with your failure, your shame, your condemnation. This has everything to do with who I am. We're coming into a whole new arena here, Moses. Right? Come here. Come to me. Take off your feet. Take off all of the stuff that connects you to this world, right? The shoe connecting to the ground. Like, this is not that connection. But come to me on holy ground, and I have something to say to you. The holiness of God is a humongously important doctrine in our hearts, right? If God is not holy, then why would we worship him? If he's not separate from us, if he's not different than us, then he's not worthy of our worship. But that's why so much of the Bible, the whole book of Leviticus, we'll see, is illustrating the holiness of God and separating it from man. Right? The whole Levitical priesthood, yes, is man, but this is God. And if man wants to approach God, this is the way he has to be. There is a difference. So this holiness is established immediately with Moses. And in verse 6, this is how God is speaking. All right, verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, God of Jacob, Moses. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Right? I am. I am. I am nothing new, but I am the one who spoke to Abraham. I am the one who has spoken to every generation before you. I'm the one who has established the promise. I am the one who has called the nation of Israel into Egypt to build them there, and now I have something else to say to you. But I am. Right. Verse 7, he says to him, I have heard. I have heard. I have seen the affliction of your people, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I am not disconnected from the difficulty here. Right? I understand what's happening. Remember, it says in the end of verse 23, 24, and 25, like God, the time had come, and God is now going to do something. I have heard. I am not disconnected. And then finally, the last one, how he speaks to him in verse 8, I have come. I have come. Right? And I have come down to deliver them out of the land of Egypt, land of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land unto a good land and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, and unto a place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. Right? This is how God speaks, and this is how he overcomes the backside of the desert. Comes this stuff, him, right? Him, and then his purpose and his ability. This is what he's saying to Moses. And as you read the rest of this chapter, read all of it. But as you read it, you see that God is looking ahead. When he speaks to Moses, he's not going to detail everything. He doesn't detail the whole thing, but like we just saw in there in verse 9, I am come and I have also seen, verse 8, right? I'm going to bring them out and I'm going to bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey. Like this is going to happen. And then we see in verse 12, when you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. Like he brings them to the end. Like the forward look of God that he like it is already finished in God's mind, right? The finished work is here. We see it. That God is calling Moses in the very beginning of the call. He's calling him to look ahead to the end of the thing, where he says, you will be on this mountain and you will serve me here. It's a powerful thing that God is leading Moses in. Okay. But we see throughout this chapter 3 and chapter 4, as God is going back and forth with Moses 5 times. 5 times Moses tries to persuade God to use somebody else. Isn't that awesome? 5 times he tries to wiggle out of this whole thing. Right? 5 times. So we see the first one is here in 3:11, when God says God says in verse 10, come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses says, whoa, 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 right? Whoa, 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 whoa. Do you realize where I am? I'm on the backside of the desert, and I'm here for a reason. I'm here because I am not the kind of guy who can go and deliver people. I tried that once, it did not work. So Moses said unto God in verse 11, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh? Right? Who am I? There's a song, isn't there? Who am I? Who am I? And I think, we can ask this question in our lives all the time, right? I think with our kids, like, who am I that God would give me these kids, right? Does he understand who he's giving these people to, right? Like leaving the hospital with a kid for the first time. Just like no idea, right? No idea. What, are you serious? Like you're going to allow me to leave? Somebody said it once, like if you try to adopt a dog, people come and visit your house and they measure your yard and they check out your whole property, right? And they determine whether or not you're worthy of adopting a dog. But when you have a kid, they just, put you in a car and send you home, right? It's like...
That's this world.
Who am I, right? Who am I that I can do any of this stuff? And I love that God answers every time Moses tries to wiggle out. Moses' excuse or reasoning is himself, right? Moses is always saying, I can't do this. Who am I? I can't speak, yada, yada, yada. God always answers it and doesn't meet Moses and say, that's right, you are, kind of useless. That's a good point. But he speaks to Moses about himself, right? So here in verse 11, Moses says, who am I? In verse 12, God answers and said, it's not you, it's me. And he said, clearly, I will be with you, and this shall be a token unto you, that I have sent thee. When you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Moses is saying, who am I? I can't, reasons, excuses. And God says, no. This is not you. This is me. And I will show you. You will be on this mountain. Like, look forward to the time that you're standing on this mountain again and understand what happens in between, right? God knows the picture. God knows what's going to happen, the plagues and the difficulties and the coups and his people, all this stuff. But he's saying, think about this. You will be standing on this mountain. And you'll look back to this day and you'll realize it wasn't you, it was me. Right? So God immediately, right? So the second one in 3:13, Moses says, what will I say? What will I say? What will I say? And Moses said unto God, behold, when I am come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, the God of our fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? What shall I say? God's answer in verse 14 is simply, it's not you, right? Moses is saying in verse 13, it's me, right? But in verse 14, God says, I am, right? God says unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus shall you say unto the children of Israel, I am has sent me unto you. I am. Yahweh, right? Yahweh. Yahweh. Not anything small. Right? But this is, when he says, I am, he's not saying, he's not saying this is what you can tell them about me. But he's saying, I am the foundation of all existence. It's so much bigger than just, I am somebody, right? Like the Egyptians had tons of gods. And the Israelites would be confronted with the idea of gods everywhere. River god, sun god, fertility god, locust god. They had them all. But God is saying, I am the foundation of all existence. Moses, this has really not much to do with you. If you will just allow me to use you, then we'll see great things happen. Right. The third time, Moses speaks back to God. Right? Don't talk back to me. He does though. Chapter 4, verse 1. And Moses answered and said, behold, they will not believe me nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord has not appeared unto you. Okay. What can I do? Right? How am I going to prove that you are God? And God says, okay, how about this? Right? Go ahead. Go ahead, I'll show you my ability. And we see from verse 2 through 7, God tells Moses to throw down the staff, right? Throw down the staff in your hand and it turns into a serpent. And you know what Moses does? He screams and runs away, basically. It says that. It's pretty funny. Verse 3, and he said, cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from before it, right? Smart, I would have too. Right? And then he says, now pick it up. He picks it up and it turns back into a staff. And he says, put your hand inside your shirt. He pulls it out and he's leprous. Now put it back in. He takes it out. It's clean. Like God is showing him his power. God is showing him his power. It's not your ability, Moses. It's my ability. Right? It doesn't matter what you can do. Right? You can't do anything. But look what I can do. And what I can do is greater than anything. So Moses gets this token from the Lord. Now, in verse 10, chapter 4 and verse 10, this is the next one, number 4. Chapter 4 and verse 10, he says, I can't speak. I can't speak. I can't speak. Right? I love that. He's trying to wiggle out of it. But Lord, I can't speak, he says there. And Moses said to the Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. There's a lot of ways that people have translated that. They say, one, he's forgotten the language in Egypt, that he doesn't remember how to speak, whatever. Pastor Stevens talked about he had a stutter, right? And Pastor Stevens, he would always say, let my people go, right? And he had a stutter or something, that there was something that was limiting his tongue. People have speculated, right? A tied tongue. Have you ever seen a tied tongue? There's like that connection between your tongue, it's two, and it limits your speech, right? So whatever it is, Moses has an insecurity of his ability to communicate. But I love God's answer. All right? When Moses tries to highlight his inability, God highlights his ability. Verse 11, the Lord said unto him, Who has made the mouth? Who makes dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Have not I the Lord? Right? Who makes the ear? I made the whole thing. So don't you think that I can do this? Don't you think that I can communicate? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you shall say. Do you trust me, Moses? The last one, 4:13. This is great, right? Moses finally just said, can you send somebody else? Right? Send another. It says in the Amplified, send by the hand of some other. Right? King James says, and he said, O my Lord, I pray thee by the hand of him whom you will send. But it says, will you just send somebody else? Right? That's it. Okay, I've tried to get out of this in every way, my speech, my ability, my location. I've tried everything. Can you just send somebody else? Right? And God... Verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. He was not so happy. But he does say in verse 15, you will speak unto him, right? He will say, I will send Aaron, right? I will send Aaron. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he comes forth to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Look at that, the preparation of the Lord, right? Okay, by the way, Aaron's going to be here in a minute. You can use him. He's going to be happy to see you, by the way, right? He gives him that little insight. And you shall speak unto him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. Right? So, whatever way Moses tries to get out of this, God confirms it. But isn't it great that none of this matters, the calling, the purpose, none of it is even spoken about until God reveals himself to Moses, right? Like when the initial conversation is, I am holy, I am, and I have heard, and I have come down to do this. Now I'm going to use you, Moses. Isn't that different than, haven't you heard, won't you do, right? Like the grace of God is so different than the law, and it's so different than natural reason, right? Because naturally we would say that God had to find somebody who was worthy of it. But instead, by the grace of God, he takes a man, a murderer like Moses, and says, okay, I have come down to do this. Will you trust me in it? And he goes in there. So the rest of this chapter, Moses returns to Egypt. Now this is interesting. Remember how we said in the beginning that Moses, he left the palace to go down to the people? Right? He went down. He went down. In the same way here he does too, actually, because right now he's on the backside of the desert, but he's with Jethro, his father-in-law, who is a high priest, and he has his family. He's actually in a favorable situation. Naturally speaking, he's in a great spot. He's disconnected from all the garbage back in Egypt, and he has his family, and he has, in some regard, a comfortable life. But he leaves it. Isn't that interesting? Here from 18 to 31, again, Moses leaves a good situation and he goes down into slavery. I don't know why that represents slavery, but it just makes sense to me. He goes down to his people. To go to the people in Israel is not, he doesn't walk in as a delegate or as a diplomat, but he comes into his people and he comes into their slavery and into their bondage. That he's not upgrading here, right? He's coming into slavery. And it's just both of, but now it is by the leading of God and the timing of God and with the purpose and revelation of God. This is a type of Christ. Right? Christ left his throne, right? Christ left heaven, and he came down to us to deliver us, but he came and he became one of us and he experienced our life, right? Hebrews talks about it over and over again, how Christ can deal with our insecurities. He can handle our life because he's felt it. And he is able to aid us, and it says in the King James, he's able to succor us, right? To give us comfort because he understands what it is. Christ descended from the best place, right? From heaven, and he came down into slavery, and he came down and he took the burden that we were all bearing, right? Because multiple times when Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, he tells them to go back to your burden. Go back to your burden. You should be working right now. Moses has never been a slave though, right? But he came into slavery so that he could deliver the people from slavery. Like what a represent throughout this book of Exodus, there is the types of Christ, and that's a big one. That Moses came down, and when Pharaoh said, "Go back to your burden," he didn't say, "Well, excuse me, Pharaoh. Actually, I've never been a slave. I grew up in your house. I just came from the priest of Midian. He's my father-in-law. I had a good spot there. I've never been a slave, so please don't identify me that way." But no, he goes to his people and he takes on their burden. And I don't know whether he ever worked and made the bricks or anything, but this is his identity. And I just think that's notable that he came down to take it. So you see in Exodus, right? So this is Exodus 2:11 through 15, when Moses tried to do it himself. But then we see in Exodus, 4:18 through 30, there's a difference. They look very similar, but there's a big difference. And the difference is the revelation of God, right? So like when we have something we want to do, we do it by our plan, or do we do it by God's plan? And the lesson learned in Moses' story is that we should do it God's way. Right? We see for the first time here in chapter 4, verse 21, the Lord said unto Moses, "When you go to return into Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart, and he shall not let the people go." Right? By the way, Moses, seemingly this isn't going to work. Right? I'm going to harden his heart, and it's not going to work. "And you shall say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto you, Let my son go, that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay your son, even your firstborn." That's ultimately happens, doesn't it? That's the final plague. That's the 10th thing that finally breaks Pharaoh. But it's given to Moses in the beginning, right? There is a finality in the plan of God. And there's a lot of ways to think about this hardening of Pharaoh's heart and the plagues. We could think of it in one way, that God is trying to manipulate his purpose to come to fruition, right? Or he says that some people would say that each plague is a reaction of God against the reaction of Pharaoh. But actually it's in the plan of God. And we see here in the very beginning, he is already saying the very end. Right? That there is no mystery in it, there's no guesswork in it, and there is no, it's not like a chess match between God and Pharaoh, where God says, "Well, I'm going to do this," and Pharaoh says, "I'm going to do this," and God says, "Ah." But actually, this is the plan of God, and he is leading Moses through it, and he knows it's going to happen. And this hardening of Pharaoh's heart is throughout, and every plague he is hardened a little bit. And this says God hardened his heart, and other places it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. But this is not a manipulation of God into his purpose, but this is the foreknowledge of God, understanding the decisions that Pharaoh will make. Right? That he says, I know, like we could say that God God makes people do things so they'll do what he needs. Right? But actually, we could think of it more that he knows already what is happening, and he knows what is in the plan, and it's going to happen that way. So the hardening of Pharaoh's heart isn't that God has to turn Pharaoh against him, but actually it's allowing Pharaoh to simply be himself. Right? Because the heart without God is hard to God. Right? So that God is not manipulating the heart of Pharaoh, but he is allowing the heart of Pharaoh to go as far as it wants to go. Romans chapter 1, he turns people over to their own ways, right? He turned them over to evil. Does that mean he made them evil? No, but he just let them go. And he allowed the heart to go wherever it would want to go, without any limiting by his grace or his mercy. So there is the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. So chapter 5, Moses and Aaron go right to Egypt, or right to the Pharaoh, and they say, "You're going to have to let my people go." And like we said in verse 4, the king of Egypt said unto them, "Wherefore do you, Moses and Aaron, let the people from their works? Get you to your burdens." That's what I was saying. Go back to your position as slaves. You're distracting the people. So what does Pharaoh do? He says, if you guys have enough time to come up with these little schemes, how about I make your work a little more difficult? Right? He takes away the straw. Right? To make brick, you need straw, the fiber that would bind everything together. And in this, they would deliver all the materials, and the Hebrews would make the bricks. But now they're not delivering them straw, so they have to go get their own straw. Right? It's not easy. So they spend time, and they still have to match the same quotas. So they spend the time scouring the countryside looking for straw or stubble, it says, and they can't match the quota. So they're abused because of it. And actually, they say they say to Moses in verse 20, they met Moses and Aaron, who stood in the way as they came from Pharaoh, and they said unto them, "The Lord look upon you and judge, because you have made our savor to be arbored in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in his eyes of his servants to put a sword in their hand to slay us." That actually they're saying, thanks a lot, guys, right? Hey, bravo, Moses and Aaron, you've just made our lives a lot more difficult. Thank you, right? Sarcastically, they're saying. But Moses goes back to God. Right? He goes to God in verse 22 and 23. And he says, why is this more difficult? Why is this worse, right? This is not helping the people. But the Lord spoke to Moses again, right? Verse 3, as I appeared unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and Jacob by the name of God Almighty, but by the name Yahweh was I not known to them. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan and the land of the pilgrimage wherein they were made strangers. I have a plan, right? He says in verse 6, say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. I will, right? I will do this, is his answer. So, at the end of chapter 6, Aaron and Moses go back to Pharaoh. Verse 28, it came to pass on the day when the Lord spoke unto Moses in the land of Egypt, that the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, I am the Lord, speak thou unto Pharaoh the king all that I say unto you. And Moses said before the Lord, behold, I am of uncircumcised lips, and how shall Pharaoh hearken unto me? So he says, I have made you, in chapter 7, I have made you a god unto Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your prophet. Right? You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of this land. So Moses is the one hearing from God, and Aaron is the one communicating it to Pharaoh. Right? That's the role. He is like the prophet. So they show up, Aaron is speaking, but Moses is behind him. He is the authority. He is the one who has the message. And they give him, they do the little duel, right? Here in chapter 7. Verse 9, he says, when Pharaoh will say, show me a miracle, take the rod and throw it down. Right? So they did it. And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did as the Lord commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh, and it became a serpent. Right? Moses and Aaron are probably like, this is it, right? Boom, serpent, boom, right? What do you have to say to that? So all of Pharaoh's counselors come and put their staffs down by their magic, and they all become serpents too. Right? Ooh, Moses and Aaron are probably like, wow, what are we going to do now? But then the Moses staff eats up all the other serpents. It swallows them up. Right? Isn't that amazing? But now the plagues start. The plagues begin, and the waters are turned to blood. And you'll see for the first few plagues, the Egyptians match. They go they match each plague by their sorcery. They match it, and they're kind of mocked. So you see, first the waters are turned to blood. Then there is a plague of frogs. Then there's a plague of lice. There are swarms of flies. Chapter 9, all the animals die. Right, the livestock die. Whoever's not is left out. But listen, look where it says in chapter 9, verse 6, and the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. Right? Not one. They're in the same region, right? The same place, but not one of the Israel's cows dies. And now there are boils. There are boils. Right? The plague of hail comes next. But again, with the plague of hail in verse 26, only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were was there no hail. Right? God's hand. God is covering. Wherever Israel is, there is no problem. And then here come the locusts. And then finally, the 11th one is there is 3 days of darkness. But look again in verse 23, chapter 10, verse 23. It was so dark that they saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Isn't that interesting? I love that picture, right? That we are here and there are things happening here, but we are in Christ. We have light, right? We have sustenance and we have protection in Him, just like the children of Israel. So through all of these plagues, right, those 9 plagues, Pharaoh waffles back and forth, right? In the midst of it, he says, okay, make it stop, and you guys can go do whatever you got to do. But then as soon as the thing stops, he hardens his heart, and he does not let them go. So finally, we see in chapter 11, the firstborn must die. And next week we'll start and we'll talk about the Passover and the significance of it. But the last plague hits, right? The last plague where the firstborn dies. Is this a surprise? It probably is for Moses to see it, yes. To Pharaoh, yes. To Egypt, yes. But to God, no. All the way back in chapter 4, he had mentioned it. He had mentioned this is what it's going to take. So through all of this, we see so much of Christ. Right? Through all of this, we see so much of the purpose of God and the hand of God. And His favor for His people. Amen? Amen. Lord, thank you for that study. Thank you for these stories that we can reflect on and see your love and your mercy, your purpose in it. Just bless our day today in your name. Amen. Amen. Any questions?